Hello and welcome to State of Play on Mint Press News. I'm your host, Greg Stoker, and whether you follow Mint Press or my personal platform at Colonial Outcasts, I know I haven't been very present over the past 2 weeks, personal stuff, but also Syria is a very difficult issue to try and cover. As you've noticed, it has entirely fractured what we could call the pro-Palestine movement. There are a lot of policing of the tone and emotions of Syrians who are jubilant that Assad is gone. For many Syrians, he was like Big Brother. He was brutal, always watching. He was the air you breathed. Also, the government was important for the axis of resistance. I mean, it will continue on just in different forms than what it was before. And yes, this Al Jolani guy, entirely problematic, former Al Qaeda, a deputy to al Baghdadi, the leader of the Islamic State in Syria. And apparently he's reformed now. He seems more like a political animal, but I know a lot of people within the US intelligence apparatus like literally want to shoot themselves because fighting Al Qaeda was the entire premise behind the unfortunately named global war on terror. Yeah, of course, it was completely an imperialist exercise, but yeah, I don't know. A lot of people, myself included, like sacrificed their youth and buried their friends to fight like this exact organization. So I'm not exactly pumped, but the focus in the media and on other similar channels, the analysis has been like just focused on, oh, this guy's former Al Qaeda. You know, this HTS, the incoming HTS government's going to be some sort of like Sunni Salafi jihadist exercise, and it's going to be horrible. We don't know that for sure. We're going to start to try and unpack what is actually going on now that we've had a couple days. The entire news cycle has been insane, but now that we've had a couple days to kind of reorient and get a pulse on what's going on. Yeah, so we're joined to that effect by Robert Inlakesh, who is a political analyst, journalist, and documentary filmmaker currently based in London, UK. He was reported from and lived in the occupied Palestinian territories and has worked for RT, Mint Press, Memo, Cuds News, TRT, Al Mayadeen, English, and many more. So thanks for coming on. It's a whole damn thing.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so starting with trying to unpack what's going on, I would assume like we want to start with this interesting thing that you and I talked about Tuesday before this, was how a lot of governments in the region, Arab governments, have a vested interest in whatever new government is coming into Syria not succeed.
Mm-hmm. Well, absolutely. These governments in the region don't want to see any sort of success story, or they don't want to see a situation, perhaps, in which a government which would emerge that allows continuation of the resistance against Israel, specifically when it comes to arming Hezbollah and the Palestinian factions, allowing Hamas to play a large role, with perhaps the exception of Qatar. In this regard, specifically when it comes to Hamas having some level of involvement. However, governments like Saudi Arabia, for instance, the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, and Egypt are, of course, looking at this and are looking at it with great concern because they could be next, particularly Jordan, it shares a border with Syria. So,
and so when you say next, you mean like the government will be next for revolutionary action that would overthrow it?
Possibly, we could see that instability inside of Syria could pour over into Jordan, and even a success story could end up inspiring people in Jordan to act and people in Egypt to act to overthrow Sisi there. So there is a fear from some of the Arab regimes in the region that this scenario here could inspire more. And of course, Saudi Arabia didn't want that to continue, doesn't want that to happen. Neither does Egypt, neither does Jordan or any of these other US-aligned Arab regimes. It is a scary scenario for them. And I think that explains why at the last minute they were jumping on to condemn the fall of Assad at the very end. They were trying to jump in to create a political solution, because what could potentially come out of the situation in Syria could backfire onto them. There could be an enormous amount of blowback. We also have to remember that many of these regimes had backed a regime change operation in Syria to remove Bashar al-Assad originally. So now they have switched, or they began to switch up, because I think they realized that this is just not the time for something like this to happen to them. However, there's a number of calculations which go into this. It could end up being good for them as well. So it's very hard to read without knowing the exact direction that Syria is going in now. There are a number of indicators, but perhaps we can get into that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think one of the big struggles for a lot of people, they've just been getting involved in foreign affairs, geopolitics and stuff through the lens of Palestine, and bringing a Palestine-oriented analysis into Syria is inherently problematic, because Palestine's simple. It's an apartheid occupation. Everybody agrees on that. But when it comes to Syria, there's so many different actors. There's so many different sects. Literally every country in the world is involved in what goes on in Syria, because it's just so strategically important. That, yeah, we could definitely get into what is actually the government right now.
Mhm. Well, we have a transitional government which has been put in place, this Syrian Salvation Government, which we don't know exactly how it's going to function at this moment. We're talking about a situation in which there's not a proper security apparatus inside of Syria right now. The army has been almost completely disbanded. Perhaps later we will see that what was the Syrian Arab Army will be integrated, or perhaps will be the model in some ways for a new Syrian army, and that we will see a better structure be put in place inside of Syria. But at this moment, we're talking about a transitional government, which is really dominated by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Now, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, as the viewers of this program here may know, was formerly al-Nusra, which is the branch of Al-Qaeda inside of Syria. So within that organization now, you might look at somebody like Abu Muhammad al-Julani, who he has changed his orientation in recent years. And
multiple times, actually.
Absolutely. He went from being a commander in Daesh, in ISIS, and then he eventually led the Syria wing of Al-Qaeda, and then he rebranded Nusra to become Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, which it now is today. And it's the most dominant faction here. So when we look at HTS as it is today, and this government, which is really led by Julani and HTS, there is a structure at the top. There's the leadership of HTS. And the leadership, you might have people like Abu Muhammad al-Julani, who, in my opinion, he can be bought and paid for, and he can be swayed politically. He understands how to behave politically. There's a reason why he put on a suit a few years ago and got on an interview with PBS and trimmed his beard. And now he is sort of resembling Zelensky.
Literally, like almost a lookalike.
Exactly. And there's a reason for that. He's done that because he understands that that has to happen. There's a number of foreign powers influencing him in this regard, whether it be the United States, Turkey, and others, Qatar, which all have a stake in what's happening now in Syria. And he, as the leader of HTS and other leaders within this movement, which also you'll see that they've sort of rebranded themselves. They've shaved, they've cut their beards, they've trimmed their beards. They're wearing suits now. Instead of military fatigues, for instance, and they are looking very different, and they're speaking differently as well. The Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, prior to, let's say, 2018, was a very different organization in terms of how it looked and how it operated in that regard. But then we have to separate that and the leadership who are talking about providing for all Syrians. We see, for instance, the celebrations which are taking place, whether they be in Damascus or Aleppo or wherever else, that you'll see women in the crowd and women that are not wearing hijab, for instance. And people might ask, why is a group which is basically an offshoot of Al-Qaeda in Syria allowing something like that to happen? Why is it talking about being a state for all people? And what we're seeing now is that HTS is having to transition itself in order to live up to this moment, out of being an internationalist, Islamic-oriented group, right? Their version of Islam, how they see it, and become a Syrian-centric organization, a liberation movement of sort. They have to remodel themselves. The problem that they're going to have and the problem they're going to face with this is not only from within their own ranks, because you have many people who are foreigners, they're Afghans, they're Uzbeks, they're Turks and others who've come to fight with HTS, and they have this ideology still. So when you try and tell them now that, you know, we want a Syrian state, which is for all of the Syrian people, and we're not pursuing this wider Islamic vision, for instance, you know, you might see them posing with the flag with the Shahada on it behind them, and then suddenly they take that away. That might enrage some people in the rank and file of HTS itself, which might cause a problem. Then you have all different myriad of other groups, right? Whether they be Islamic groups or more secular leaning groups. The Islamic groups are a lot more powerful, who have different visions of what Syria should look like, of what the agenda should be now for this revolutionary tide that they have behind them of, you know, taking over large swaths of land. And this could cause a clash. And so at the moment, we have seen that there are steps that are being taken by this HTS administration, which do show moderation, which are speaking against some of the sectarian lines that were taken before. But at the same time, we also have to look at what HTS is in terms of its rank and file. Also, the groups that are beside it, supporting it, have been its allies traditionally. And then also the foreign influences as well. Turkey, for instance, does not want Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which operates a government which looks like the Taliban government in Afghanistan. That's not what they want. And the United States also, what they're going to do, and this poses a huge problem to the legitimacy of the new Syrian government, they're going to want the new Syrian government to serve their interests.
Mm-hmm.
And so you'll see that Abu Muhammad al-Julani is going to have to take stances which are going to be in line with US, Qatari, Turkish interests. And that robs him of a certain level of legitimacy. For instance, on the Israeli front, that's one that will rob him of an enormous amount of legitimacy. And all that time, the US can dangle the card of sanctions over his head. HTS is still a proscribed terrorist organization. It's not been lifted yet.
Actually, there's a lot of diplomatic language going on. They're telegraphing that if you get in line, we will lift the categorization of terrorist from your organization, and of course that affects sanctions and aid as well. But yeah, they're definitely using it as the carrot right now before they bring in the stick, which the stick is basically just an Israeli airstrike on Jolani.
Yeah,
well.
and that could
He's
happen.
pretty much in an impossible situation.
That could very much happen. And if you want a model for how this sort of situation can end up panning out, you can look, and it's obviously not 100% comparable, but if you look at what happened in Sudan with the overthrow of Omar Bashir, after Bashir was overthrown, then you had US backing, which was provided to both the rapid support forces and the military government there too, both sides pushing them towards Israeli normalization and, you know, adopting a neoliberal economic model, etc., working for US and Israeli strategic interests. But what happened, and obviously the sanctions were dangled over their head, the terrorist prescription was dangled over their head, clearing their debt, providing foreign aid. These were all things that the US offered to the new Sudanese transitional government. Ultimately, what happened there, because there were so many colliding foreign interests inside of Sudan, is that it ended up in the situation we see today in a massive civil war. And although Syria is completely different, and this could go in so many different ways, there is the fear now that perhaps this could turn out to be a very similar situation where this might not be the end. This might not be the end government that we're seeing in Syria.
Mhm.
This government here could be overthrown. There's still large portions of the Syrian Arab army and people who are working with the Syrian government who are actually still there, the former Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad, who are still there in Syria. And those people could end up teaming up with certain organizations which used to be with the Syrian opposition, which they used to be fighting each other. And they could end up forming an alliance to oust this group or the other, or maybe there's an alliance against HTS at some point. So there are so many possibilities here. And unfortunately, because of the fact that the US is going to demand that there can absolutely be no compromise on the issue of the Israelis, there won't be any attacking Israel, there will not be allowing weapons transfers to Lebanon, etc. This could jeopardize the stability of Syria.
Yeah. Also, the U.S. will not accept any government that will not normalize with Israel.
Mhm.
So,
And this is also an issue. Like the United States have their class of Syrian opposition politicians, which they back as well, which they want to be in a position of power here. And so do the Turkish government as well. They have groups that they explicitly back who are sort of under their jurisdiction. And HTS is like one step removed from that. It's the one with all of the power. It has multiple different influences on it. But it's not 100% a proxy of Qatar, Turkey, the US. It works and it's sort of maneuvering in this environment. Although ultimately the fear is that if it steps out of line with one of these interests, the whole deck of cards can collapse. And this is the situation that I think we're watching right now. Yes, people are, on one side devastated. For instance, if you speak to a lot of Syrian Christians and from different minority communities inside of Syria, you'll see that they're devastated. And then on the other side, I'd say from the vast majority of the Syrian refugee population and many people who were inside Syria as well, they're overjoyed. They're over the moon. And it's, like Liberation Day. So they're still coming to terms with what has just happened. But at this time as well, people are still looking sort of with some cautious optimism of what could come. And some people are very depressed at the situation because they've assumed that this will not develop into anything good. I believe that this could go in a more positive direction. There's a route there for it. For instance, Hamas can be used in this regard to negotiate when it comes to the Iran's axis of resistance, for instance, and the groups that it supports. I believe there is a role that Hamas can play inside of Syria right now to sort of facilitate that, to not completely undermine Iran's role in the region, which would make Iran more happy with the situation, perhaps might even provide a means of getting certain weaponry inside Syria at some point. I think for now, advanced weapons going in inside of Lebanon is cut for now. But there's so many different ways that we could look at this and break it down, and coming to a conclusion on whether it's going to be a catastrophic civil war, and we're going to see different groups with extreme ideologies fighting each other. And unfortunately, the case is right now that the most strong groups inside of Syria, their ranks are filled with a lot of paid mercenary fighters, or in some cases,
the level of foreign fighters is quite shocking, and it was during the first iteration of this war back in 2012, 2013. The insane flood of foreign fighters into the country, fighting for different factions, different sects, was kind of mind-boggling at the time. And which is kind of why we get articles in the LA Times from like 2014. US-backed militias funded by the CIA and the Pentagon are like fighting each other. It was just kind of a mess. And it just basically highlights the shifting dynamics and allegiances that have developed in Syria over the past 10 years. And we can expect that going forward. I know, like, even looking at a map right now, if you're just listening to the audio, we're pulling up Syria Live map. It's just basically like an open source intelligence map that updates all the territorial gains and holds. So I guess they've taken out ISIS off the map, even though there are small pockets of the Islamic State that still exist in central Syria and around the Kurdish-controlled AANES. But the U.S. has been striking ISIS targets heavily. We're going to talk about Israeli aggression. They're basically in the blue right here, expanding outside of the Golan Heights into the suburbs of Damascus. But we definitely do have recorded clashes between the Kurds, the U.S.-backed Kurds, the Syrian Defense Forces, and the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army going on right now. How much of a concern is that, like, do you think, spilling out into wider violence?
Well, certainly for the Kurdish movements, it's a huge threat. Also, I don't believe that in the long run, the Turkish government is going to allow the SDF to continue operating there.
Mhm.
There is an argument that if the new Syrian government seizes, for instance, the Al Ammar oil fields, then at least it gets its access to the oil fields. And then in northeastern Syria, it's sort of the breadbasket of Syria. So it would actually help the country if they could, reboot agriculture in the country, and they could be more self-sustaining. The country could sustain itself more so. Obviously, it's going to need an enormous amount of aid and help from a myriad of countries, especially with the influx of refugees who are coming back to Syria now. That's an enormous strain. But if you look at the SDF-controlled territories, ultimately, I don't believe that the Turkish government will allow them to operate there for that much longer.
They're pretty entrenched, though. Like, and they've historically, I mean, the United States has betrayed the Kurds multiple times, but they still back them in terms of aid, weapons. Also, there are U.S. troops around those oil fields. As Trump is always great at saying the quiet part out loud. We have the oil. We're guarding the oil. There's also a small special operations footprint in the region. I'm not plugged into that at all, but it's part of the Operation Inherent Resolve. To inherently not resolve anything, which is the counter ISIS operation that's going on there. So the Kurds seem pretty entrenched, the AANES, in terms of their de facto government in the region.
They are to an extent, but also we have to look at what's happened over the past year. For instance, a lot of the Arab tribal forces, which are based on both sides of the Euphrates, have been getting angry. There's been for years actually a lot of sectarian tension, which was spread by rumors on both sides, both the Kurdish side and the Arab side, about like racist violence and ethnocentric rule and the likes. And there's been a lot of fighting between the Arab tribal forces and the SDF forces. And also we had to remember that the SDF has within its ranks the likes of people in the PKK, but then it has its more leftist elements. And also it does have Arabs that are part of it too, that operate part and are part of the SDF. For instance, you have the Deir ez-Zor Military Council, and this is where it starts to get a little bit more complex. And the Deir ez-Zor Military Council, when it was first started, it's predominantly run by Arabs. And at first, it factored in some forces who were once part of Daesh as well. And they used them at first to secure the Al Ammar oil fields when the SDF fought with the United States to defeat ISIS around that area and take control of the oil fields. The SDF, I don't believe they can hold off if the Turks attack. And then there's an attack from the new Syrian government forces, which are led by HTS and other groups. There's literally I don't even know how many Syrian groups that are operating now, dozens of them, that, have weapons and the ability to fight. Then you have the Arab tribal forces that, we don't know where their allegiances are going to lie and what groups can be activated to fight against the Kurdish forces there. You have the SNA, And obviously Turkey itself as well. And Turkey is very explicit. It doesn't want a Kurdish state run by elements of the PKK on its border, and it won't accept it. And that for Turkey is a non-negotiable position. And we've seen with the two major operations that Turkey has carried out inside northern Syria, whether northwest or northeast Syria, that the United States ran away both times. And without the support of the United States, are they going to hold out against, a myriad of groups perhaps launching some sort of an offensive against them? That's yet to be seen. Maybe there can be an agreement struck somehow with the SDF. That always is possible, but also they could fall very rapidly as well. And what that will look like as well is something that we don't know yet. Again, inside of Syria right now, how things are developing, one day it looks like there's progress, and that the government is showing signs of moderation, for instance, and that it's looking towards governing for all Syrian people. But then the next day there's 15 executions because it's completely lawless and there's no security forces to stop any of this. And there are, foreign fighters, people who have vendettas, all of these sort of things. People that are just poor, they want to loot and steal, and are carrying out these sort of acts. And this could easily erupt into sectarian violence. So this is always something, especially if they go into the Kurdish areas and you allow some people who have, their own vendettas in that area to just do whatever they want. This could lead to great violence against the Kurdish minority. So it's very difficult to see exactly how that will unfold. Ultimately, I don't think the SDF could hold off if Turkey decided to go all in and clear the area or take control of the area. That's my own personal opinion on the matter. I may be wrong, of course. This is an ever-changing.
When it comes to Syria, everybody may be wrong. One thing that we can definitely look at, though, kind of not with greater certainty, but at least more clear-eyed, is the Israeli invasion of expanding their quote-unquote military buffer zone out of the Golan Heights into the suburbs of Damascus. I've been paying attention to what the op-eds being written in more right-wing newsletters like Mariv, even in Haaretz. They're talking about using this as an opportunity to redraw the map, create a new Middle East. I don't know really what their goals are beyond this just looking like an opportunistic land grab. It seems like looking at their military actions over the past year, it's basically just send ground troops in and figure it out. I don't really know what their goals are, what they're trying to achieve, but their thing is to send in boots on the ground, see what happens. They've also done an insanely high intensity air operation, airstrike campaign against basically all of Syria's military infrastructure. It's gone. They also dropped 15 vessels in the port around Latakia. And from my perspective, this is to basically defang the entire security establishment of whatever Syrian government comes into power. And that will take decades to rebuild. So they won't be any sort of military threat in the region. Also, whatever government does take control won't have any sort of high advanced weaponry or military infrastructure to fight sectarian groups that are rebelling or anything like that. So it just seems like by destroying this military infrastructure, they're creating a situation where they will justify their quote unquote buffer zone and their military involvement in Syria indefinitely.
Absolutely. And it gives them the strategic high ground. They took control of Jebel al-Sheikh, Mount Hermon, I think in English. And so they have the strategic high ground there in the Golan Heights region, and now they've solidified their control over it. They've met no resistance. And really, again, because of the political situation, it's an impossible situation for any Syrian government to deal with. Number one, if you fight them, the Israelis, it's not guaranteed that you're going to get anywhere. You might even lose more. It might be even more difficult. But they're in a situation where they're being pressured by so many foreign powers that they can't even issue a statement against it. You won't even see a statement issued against the Israeli bombardment of Damascus, of their military assets, the seizure of land. And this is an Israeli plot, by the way. This has been long the plan by the Israelis. And that's why back in 2013, not only was there a plan presented to Netanyahu to expand the buffer zone into Syria, about 10 miles into Syrian territory, which was later backed up by the United States. The United States proposed that there was a similar strategy carried out as happened in the mid 1970s in Lebanon, with what developed into Israel's occupation of South Lebanon, using local forces and backing local forces in southern Syria in order to secure that area and to secure their own force, which will basically be their proxy in the region, like the South Lebanon Army was in South Lebanon up until the year 2000. And the Israelis had their own military presence, but they wanted local forces to deal with that situation so that they didn't have to do all the dirty work, sort of like what they've got now with the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. All that, the domestic security situation in the major cities in the West Bank is controlled by the Palestinian Authority security forces, not by the Israeli occupation forces. They don't have to do the heavy lifting. So they put forth this plan. The US backed it in 2013. Israel at that time started backing at least a dozen different Syrian opposition groups. One of those groups was Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. At the time as well, and this is very notable, at the time that they were still giving weapons, financial support, and treating Nusra fighters in field hospitals in the Golan Heights, Nusra was allied with ISIS at that same time, led by Jolani, to take over Yarmouk refugee camp, the Palestinian refugee camp in central Damascus. So Israel didn't care who they were backing. They would back anyone and everyone. There was a specific group, I'm trying to, something in Julan, that they backed, which was sort of like their proxy group. They sent $5,000 in aid every single month. Each fighter would get like $75 salary, for instance, and they backed them to just do their bidding in southern Syria. And the goal ultimately for them is to take an area which the buffer zone would expand in 3 phases up to the area near Sweda. So they would have to incorporate some sort of a Druze, which is a minority group in Syria, Druze force into this. In 2020, the Israelis actually were involved. There's some evidence that were involved in a party which emerged, which is called the Syrian Liwa Party. And this group emerged suddenly out of nowhere in 2020 amidst, protests started erupting from the Druze minority in the south of the country due to, for instance, subsidies being pulled away, mismanagement, corruption. There was lots of gang activity as well in these areas, which caused friction. So there was, a lot of anger in a lot of these heavily Druze populated areas. This party emerges. Suddenly it's making contacts with US-backed forces, which are completely proxy forces, the forces in El-Tanf. In El-Tanf, they're just US proxy. They don't, I don't think they have any ideology. They're just being paid to be there. Those groups in El-Tanf, they don't have their own ideology, in my opinion. They made contact with them, in contact with the United States, and presented a vision for the future of trying to expel the Assad government forces from the south of Syria, which was exactly what I believe in 2022, the Israelis sent the head of the Palestinian Druze community to Moscow to pitch, and that was federalization of Syria, where you have a Druze rump state essentially in the south, which would act in Israel's favor essentially, but it would be that Druze minority space that they would have, like a balkanization of the region. So this is not something you can track it back to 2013. The documentation is there, the evidence is there. And Israel, of course, for a very long time, since it seized the Golan Heights originally in 1967, and then seized it again, and took more land, advanced further into Syria in 1973. And then they annexed it officially in 1981. Israel's always been seeking to expand this area. They wanted the strategic high ground in the Golan Heights. They want to secure the Golan Heights because of water resources, gas, for instance, the potential for gas extraction there. It's good for tourism as well. And ultimately, the more land, the better, the Israelis have been thinking. So this has been a plot that has been ongoing. The Israelis never gave up on it. They've always been working towards it. And the reason why Syria was so divided towards the end and so weak, even amongst the Druze, who had been very, very loyal to the government of Bashar al-Assad up until that point, many of those communities, they did not turn on Assad. And, many of the leaders there were in favor of the government, was because the sanctions had strangled Syria to such a point where all corruption, all issues in the country just came to a head. It was as clear as day. Everyone could see everything for what it was. Even small corruption is more noticeable when you don't have money to fill your car, gas up your car, or you can't eat meat because you're that poor that you can't afford meat. And all of these things factor into why, for instance, you see the rise of criminal elements who are trading Captagon, for instance, and why people start becoming disloyal to an army that they'd fought for, and maybe they'd given, their brothers and their sons and daughters to this army and to this cause that they believed in, why that could start to collapse because of the fact that when you don't have anything to eat, Syria is not being rebuilt. It doesn't matter anymore. That ideology has collapsed. Things are not getting better. And so you're able to exploit the country more. People are desperate. People are going to take bribes. People are going to turn and ally themselves with whoever they can just to rid themselves of their situation that they're living through. So everything became destabilized. And the sanctions in that effect, they really worked on Syria.
Yeah, and so we should definitely talk about that, and just for the audience, the one of the ways that the U.S. is able to power project and carry out its political will is A, through military intervention, either direct or through proxies, and B, through economic sanctions, economic warfare, essentially starving out a country in terms of money, trade, outside investment, import, export, make the life of the average person so unbearable that they revolt against the government that the U.S. does not like. We tried it with Russia. If you guys recall, during the outset of the invasion of Ukraine, The Economist and all these like legacy media outlets in the West were saying, life for people is untenable with these sanctions. There's going to be a palace coup. Putin will be overthrown. There'll be a popular revolution. Been trying to do this maximum pressure campaign of economic sanctions against Iran in order to help facilitate a regime change. Hasn't happened. But as Robert was saying, yes, it definitely did work here in Syria, we could say.
Yeah, absolutely. And that really contributed. And at the end, you can see these videos of CNN going into, the presidential palace or looking at Assad's car collection. I don't know the ins and outs of that, but for sure, those senior officials and Bashar himself were not personally suffering like the people were from the sanctions. It's just not what happens. The people suffer, like happened in Iraq. It's the same thing. People, 90% of Syrians, it was estimated, were below the poverty line. So that's how the Syrian people were living. In fact, Syrians who were in Idlib, which was deeply deprived at many points of all resources, people in Idlib were living better than people under the control of government areas in many cases. People were just incredibly poor. And this includes everyone. This includes the Sunni majority, and it includes all the minority communities as well. So the pressure was immense. And a lot of people who were fighting on the side of the government, who believed in the government. So, for instance, you have like a lot of, and it's not all Christians believe one thing, all Sunni believe one thing or whatever. The majority of the Syrian Arab army, its fighters anyway, their conscripts were Sunni because the majority of the population is Sunni. It makes sense, right? I'm not saying anything about leadership or whatever. I'm just saying about the actual army itself. Those people who fought and died for that vision of Syria under Bashar as the leader believed that Syria was going to return to what Syria was before 2011. that things were just going to be restored to normal, and that their country would be free of foreign interference. And that's what they genuinely had in their minds. In 2018, the fighting stopped completely. They signed the Astana Accords, the Syrian government with the Turkish government and the Iranians and the Russians. All the fighting stopped. Nothing got better. Everything got worse. And in the end, for somebody to want to pick up a weapon and fight for what cause at the end of the day. And obviously that's not exactly what happened in this case. Like the fall of Aleppo, for instance, was because generals called their troops back. They were told to withdraw. There was no fighting. In fact, there was no fighting inside of Aleppo, no real fighting inside of Aleppo. There was no fighting inside of Hama or in Homs or in Damascus. There was fighting in the countrysides, but there was no actual fighting inside. They gave it up and they withdrew. So there was obviously something else going on in the background. There were agreements which were struck, evidently, accusations one way or another, which I won't get into now. And this sort of gets into sources and what they tell you. But, ultimately the people in Syria were suffering greatly. And the situation has now dramatically changed. That may change eventually for the betterment of the living standards of the people of Syria. It may allow for instance, the resistance to continue in a similar way that it has, over, let's say, the past few decades with Iran's construction of this axis of resistance. Or it may take a different form now. It may be new groups emerging. It may be that Hamas plays a greater role, for instance, in Syria, or it could not be. So there are many possibilities on the table. I think at the moment, as much as possible to encourage that, the best possible process there, just for the sake of the people. The last thing we want to see is sectarian violence and this head to the direction of further civil war, where it's just everyone is fighting everyone and taking whatever backing they can, because that would be ultimately catastrophic. So it's a very difficult situation to read right now. There's so many different foreign powers vying for their interests, and it's sort of a free-for-all at the moment. So what we're seeing currently is that this could go in a different direction. There could be new relations made. There are groups in Syria, for instance, that are open to, right now, and they really do want to commit themselves to the Palestinian resistance. But will that be allowed to happen? What is going to happen? What sort of people are we going to see implementing the laws? Will Syrian society coexist? Syrians are, not a sectarian people by nature. If you look at them before, very, very united. The idea of people asking each other what their faith background is on the street is something that just wasn't the case. Syrians in general are not like that. So there is a possibility that the Syrian people will come together and forge a new future. But there are so many foreign influences that competing ideologies, which could make this very difficult and could take this down a very negative direction, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's kind of why I wanted to bring up earlier in this episode the SDF fighting the Syrian National Army. So Syrian National Army, demonstrably Turkish-backed, Kurds backed overwhelmingly by the United States, armed, funded. We've sent them training advisors like Green Berets, special forces groups, to help train them to fight the Islamic State and other elements in the region that we don't like. And they're fighting each other. Two NATO-backed states fighting each other. And I think from the outsider who doesn't really have any experience with Syria or a strong knowledge base, I think that's just a really good situation to highlight when it comes to talking about this, because those are just two of the big ones. Okay, you got the SDF, the Kurds, Syrian National Army, HTS, and a hundred other groups as well. And again, as you brought in the Arab tribal powers and forces within the region, which aren't necessarily declared for anything yet. taking like a wait and see approach. But I did want to focus more on we already kind of touched on this, how HTS really politically cannot afford to challenge Israel right now. And even if they did, what would that accomplish? The narrative that I'm seeing going around in a lot of our spaces is they're Al Qaeda. The CIA runs Al Qaeda. That's why they'll never attack Israel, and that's kind of infantile and a juvenile analysis of the whole thing. So I would say.
I'd say there's an element, like if you look at the rank and file of HTS, there's an enormous amount of people that have that Al-Qaeda ideology.
Yeah.
But then if you look at, for instance, those who are in its leadership, there's the difference. And there are people that are able to, they're politically savvy, you know. I don't believe Abu Muhammad al-Julani is stuck to one ideology specifically, so hardline. He skips in between groups, you know, he's able to splinter certain groups and break off into others. Obviously take foreign backing at some point. Nusra, which is HTS, it's just a rebrand essentially, led by the same people, was taking backing, and its fighters were being treated by the Israelis at one point. But at the same time, you've got many people inside of HTS that would say we were going to liberate Palestine, and you know, today is Damascus and tomorrow is Jerusalem.
Yeah, and so I think some of the most telling videos from the street, I think it was when they first took Aleppo, there was a video of an HTS guy like taking down a Christmas tree and like overturning it, and there was other members in a later video putting the Christmas tree back up from the same group. So yeah, it's kind of hard to characterize.
That just highlights the divisions which are you know, inherent in this organization. And you know, it doesn't want to appear a certain way, but certain members will carry out acts lawlessly.
Field executions.
Field executions will occur. And not all these field executions are committed by HTS. They're committed by the myriad of other groups as well that are operating there. Even when HTS came into Aleppo, they had an instant clash with Jaish al-Islam. And they were shooting each other in the streets. I mean, more people essentially died inside of Aleppo between the opposition groups than fighting the Syrian army. There were clashes that started immediately. These groups, you know, there are so many of them. Some of them are just hardline, you know, Al-Qaeda ideology. That's how they are. There are smaller groups that just think like that, and they are not in any way secular. They don't care about a Syrian state, Syrian sovereignty, even the idea of a Syrian state to them. What is that? What is a Syrian state? That doesn't make sense. You know, we're not for a national flag. We're for what they would call an Islamic state, right, or a caliphate, in their vision and their view of Islam. Rather warped view, I might add. But there are groups like that, and then there are people like that in HTS. Then in HTS, you do have people that belong to HTS who are sort of like mercenaries. They'll do exactly what they're told. So it's a complex picture inside that organization. I do believe if it's pressured in the right ways, there is a prospect for something working and there to be some sort of settlement. Will there be issues? Absolutely. But can Syria emerge from this better and start clearing out some of these more extremist elements and factions? It is also possible. I don't think we have to be completely doom and gloom about the situation. But
that is the overwhelming analysis that's being given right now, though. We have to recognize that.
At the same time, it's something that it could head in that direction. So there has to be people have to be, I believe, cautious when analyzing it, because right now we are in a transitional phase, and we don't know exactly where it is going to go. And there are a myriad of very extreme groups and individuals, which will make this very difficult. And the thing is, on the Israeli question and about HTS fighting Israel and combating Israel, The problem that they could face is if they don't fight Israel, and I can imagine that Israel might eventually decide, if they think it's safe to do so, to go to some suburb or go to some place near Damascus where you can see Damascus, the city, in the background, and put an Israeli flag up for a photo, because that's just how they operate. They like to do things like this. But there could be a loss of legitimacy there. The majority of Syrians who are backing the opposition side, ultimately everyone on each side of this conflict, despite the polar opposite views and what they think of each other, ultimately mostly want the same thing. The Syrian people, they want the same thing. They do all believe that their country, they want a stable country, they want a safe country for all. They want a democratic country, many of them. They have different iterations of that, but they want to be opposed, for instance, to Israel. The vast majority of Syrians are not pro-Israeli, they're pro-Palestinian. And you see that amongst all Syrians, essentially. You'd be hard-stretched to find Syrians who will say, I'm pro-Israeli, other than some people who are just completely backed by the Washington think tanks or security establishment. And so, again, HTS can lose credibility if it doesn't even make statements against Israel. If it just keeps talking about how Iran is the problem, but Iran is gone, and we are here to fight Iran, but then Israel is invading more of your territory, and then Israel might use Syrian territory that it captures to attack Lebanon through the Bekaa. If that happens as well, and could you imagine if the Palestinian refugee camps inside of Lebanon are activated and start fighting the Israelis? In those refugee camps, there's many groups there which are linked to the Syrian groups which were existing before, in Idlib, for instance. So what happens when these groups are under attack, and they literally are part of the same organizations, when they're under attack, when they're fighting the Israelis? How does this work? So there are so many variables here which could change this picture dramatically. And that's why I think Israel instantly eliminated the weapons throughout Syria. It eliminated all its advanced capabilities and defensive capabilities as well, because it understood that this situation could perform a 180 out of their favor. And this could suddenly become something else. Iran does already have contacts and inroads that it can make inside Syria with a variety of different groups there. Also, the Palestinians are going to be in some way welcomed. Even if the US are demanding that they're out, there will be groups inside of Syria which will welcome them and will welcome Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and others into the country. That will happen. They're not going to be completely isolated in Syria. Eventually, they will be welcomed there, because you won't be able to stop them from not being welcomed there. And Israel understands this. So again, right now, Israel's taking advantage of this situation. Israel is taking advantage of the fact that the United States is hanging the sanctions card over this new HTS administration, whether it lasts or not. It does not want to, jeopardize its future right now. Abu Muhammad al-Julani is vowing for power. He wants to, be the most powerful actor in Syria. He wants his party to take control, and he wants to be that man. Whether that will happen or not, I don't know. But if he starts stepping too much out of line, like you said, there could be an Israeli airstrike that comes in and takes him out. Not because necessarily they think that at some point they couldn't work with him, or that they can't communicate with him, or the United States doesn't think that they can communicate with him. Just because he's in an impossible position and he has to act and he has to do something against the Israelis, even if it's symbolic. And I think the Israelis don't even want that. They want to ensure that there's a situation in Syria, either they get an administration which normalizes with them, or complete and utter chaos. And then they use this buffer zone with their proxies to keep that chaos under wraps and keep it away from them.
No, I mean, as we were talking about, I would definitely call it controlled chaos. That is basically what the United States wouldn't be too unhappy with. The Gulf states probably want a little less chaos than the U.S. can handle. The big fear is Syria 2.0 spilling out in destabilizing the entire region.
Mhm.
And of course, Qatar has its own vested interest in having a stable-ish Syria, has to do with oil, other things as well. Turkey
Mhm.
doesn't want an massively uncontrolled war zone. So the amount of pressure that's being put on the incoming HTS government is kind of impossible to resolve politically, and then the only other option is absolute chaos.
Mhm.
And the entire situation looks like it's bouncing on a knife edge.
And it's something that if someone is going to tell you 100% they know exactly where it's heading, either they're incorrect, most likely. They're lying to you or they're lying to themselves, because I don't believe we know exactly where this, because there are so many converging interests inside of Syria right now. I mean, this could even spill over into Jordan. What happens if it spills over into Jordan? Yes, maybe those groups in Syria can be controlled, but will you control the groups that would emerge inside of Jordan, for instance, with a Palestinian majority population there, sharing the longest border with Israel? Would that situation, what would that situation bring? If you have, for instance, factions which are ready to fight the Israelis and go across, how would you control that situation? What would you do if Sisi falls and the Egyptian government is changed again? So it's very unpredictable right now, and any of these things can happen. Even in the West Bank, this could inspire change in the West Bank. We've already seen over the past week that the factions, the resistance factions in the West Bank, are now clashing directly with the Palestinian Authority.
Mhm.
Could that be? Could this provide more inspiration to that? It could do. So again, this is a situation that's very hard to say absolutely this will happen. Um, but I think it's important to understand all of these different actors and how they collide. I don't think it's a situation where everyone has to be utterly depressed, because out of these sort of situations, maybe something different can come. I don't believe the Palestinian people will ever stop resisting. Maybe the resistance will look different and it will come in different forms, but they won't stop. And if you look at the arc of history, there was a strategic defeat, you might say, but inspired further resistance afterwards, which occurred with the Arab Revolt in 1936 to 39. The Palestinians were defeated by the British and the Zionists. In 1948, that was also a defeat. 1967 was a defeat. And 1973 was a defeat. And 1982 was a big defeat. The PLO had been pushed around from everywhere. It was pushed out in 1970 from Jordan, and it set up base over in Lebanon. It was eventually forced to retreat from Lebanon. And when the PLO fled Lebanon, Israel used its right-wing fascist militias to commit massacres of thousands of innocent people in refugee camps. Later on, we saw that the resistance reemerged. Nobody could have imagined in 1982 that something called Hezbollah would rise and push the Israelis from southern Lebanon. No one could imagine that suddenly this little thing called Hamas, which before that was the Mujama al-Islamiyya, before it became Hamas in 1988 or 1987, sort of, would emerge as the most powerful actor. And then from the West Bank and Gaza, you have this Islamic resistance, which comes, and all these new factions which emerge and would possess rocket capabilities, for instance. So resistance will continue. No one's going to forget. I think the entire people of the region are scarred from the horrors that we've all witnessed happen in Gaza. No one's going to lose those images from their minds. It will always scar everyone's minds, and the resistance will continue. And it doesn't matter, even if there are setbacks and differences that occur, there's always a road forward. And I believe that we don't have to view anything as this is an ultimate defeat and throw aside the whole situation, or view it in the other way, that this is the biggest victory in the world, and then blindly just ignore all of the facts of what's happening. I saw, for instance, a lot of the coverage on the Arabi media over the weekend, where they were ignoring Israeli airstrikes, even in the Arabi media inside of Syria, and that's helping, add to this environment that we have right now, which is polar opposites, either depressed or extremely happy. Dictator has fallen and everything's going to be great, or
The
this
axis of resistance is done. Western imperialism has won first now, and then China's next. Yeah. I'll just say this: if you think that the U.S. is the puppet master that it is, it's been historically completely unable to control groups and actors within this part of the world. First of all, second, one of the big victories that's happened thus far is education. People have woken up over the past year, especially in the West, to what's going on, our society, what Israel is, and our problematic involvement in the region too. So an entire generation has been alienated by what's happened over the past year. So that's another thing to consider before we get all doomy and gloomy.
Yeah, I believe that, there are a lot of conspiracies that are set, but not all of them go to plan. I don't think the United States could have anticipated exactly what happened in Afghanistan, which led to the withdrawal. I don't think it could have, or it did anticipate what happened in Iraq and the situation which emerged there. I don't think it anticipated the consequences of invading Lebanon when it did as well, and placing its troops there. All of these, policies and all of these conspiracies which have been set upon the people of the region, some of them have panned out exactly how they planned. But even the regime change operation, which was launched by the United States, Timber Sycamore, one of the most expensive CIA
$1 billion.
Exactly. And they wasted that because Donald Trump collapsed that. So they poured all this money into a regime change operation against Bashar al-Assad. And then afterwards, it happened much later. After they'd abandoned it, I believe in 2017, Trump disbanded the program.
Yeah.
And so it happened now in 2024 that the regime change actually occurred. But it didn't happen when they wanted it to, in the way that necessarily they wanted it to. They didn't necessarily know that even this would work right now, that Damascus would fall. I was told, although I didn't believe it, by a source in Damascus at the time, that Damascus was going to fall within a week. I was told, give it a week, when Aleppo was taken. But other than that, I hadn't heard anyone call the situation for what it was. There are many things that went on behind the scenes which I think need to also be analyzed as to how this exactly happened. But I think the U.S. Obviously it does try and influence the opinions of people, and we have to remember, even with the Iraq War, there were groups of Iraqis that celebrated when U.S. troops came in. That did actually happen, and obviously a lot of people changed their views afterwards. But there were people with such legitimate grievances against Saddam Hussein at the time, who was a monster to them, right? Who had committed heinous crimes against them, who hated Saddam Hussein and were happy when the U.S. forces came in, and in fact pulled down the statues of Saddam Hussein, rode them through the streets. For instance, like we see in Syria right now, we see people are riding the statues of Hafiz al-Assad, and we see people are very jubilant and celebratory for the fall of their dictator. Like, that is the way that the people are behaving. But in the case of Iraq, what happened afterwards is not something that I think even Iraqis, you ask them today, what do you think of Saddam Hussein now? None of them are going to come back to you and say, I like Saddam Hussein, who had that opinion. But they will say that the invasion was wrong. They will say that they, and I've heard people admit to me that, our interpretation was wrong at the time. So people will come to understand what's going on later, and it's very hard to read it. I'm not saying that Syria is like Iraq, and that the situation is the same, the government is the same. It's not the same situation, and there's a lot of differences. And I would say that Syria is a lot more complicated as well than Iraq was. Iraq was a little bit more easy for people to understand. But still, again, with those legitimate grievances that people have, how do you get over that? When your family member has been killed by the other side, whoever they may be, how do you get over that? How are you going to tell that person to get along? And that is going to be the great test in Syria, can people move past what happened in the past? Can they move past it? Can they say, okay, we fought this war, but now we need to work for a better Syria? Can they put that aside, and can that be done? And I think now is a state of, joy for many, depression for others. But what will happen when the dust settles is that the pieces have to be picked up, and we will start to see, perhaps in the coming months, maybe it will even take years, we'll see what will actually come of the situation in Syria. But it's so pivotal, Syria, that I don't see it ending in a situation like Libya, personally. Again, with all that I'm saying right now, this is based upon the current situation. And I could be wrong, but I don't feel there is a need to jump to drastic conclusions yet. And hopefully we will see that even some of these extremist elements are rooted out, and that the Syrian people are able to pave the way to a better future for themselves, where they have an independent state led by them, and they can agree. And now Bashar is out of the picture. There's no debate around Bashar anymore. He's gone.
Mhm.
So now it's about what sort of Syria do you want, and forget the Bashar government and all of the problems that you had. And now you have a new Syria. And so that is what we're going to see, and we're going to see whether it works or not, and whether those foreign influences, whether those extremist groups and individuals are going to plunge Syria into more chaos before it rises again, into the new government which will operate there.
Yeah. Sorry, we can't give you more beyond a wait and see approach, but this isn't the end of the axis of resistance. This isn't the end of resistance. This is not the triumph of Western imperialism in the region. It's way more complicated and way more uncertain than those absolutist predictions. So,
and I might just add, just before we wrap up, that with the Hezbollah issue, Hezbollah has the weapons capacity, and has the capacity to manufacture certain kinds of weapons, light weapons, underground. It can defend itself. It can defend Lebanon. It will continue to exist. It can still get funding. The more sophisticated weapons, for now, are not coming towards it, but it will continue to exist. People are saying it's going to become more Lebanon-centric, for instance. I'm not sure that's the direction it will head, but it's not going to not exist. Hamas, for instance, has survived for 14 months and is still fighting with weapons it manufactured itself underground. And yes, of course, Gaza has been completely destroyed, but Hamas is still there. Hamas is still fighting on the ground, and all those other resistance groups from the Palestinian side are still fighting.
and recruiting.
And recruiting. So I don't believe this is the end of Hezbollah, for instance. And I can't see it being the end of Hezbollah. And in fact, maybe there will be perhaps a transition inside of Hamas now to adapt to this current reality. But Hamas may play a larger role in the future. That would be my prediction. And we're going to see a different map. Like obviously Netanyahu wants his own map of the Middle East. I don't think his vision will come to fruition. However, there are great threats posed now, including, I believe, to Iran. The Israelis may be emboldened to attack Iran and attack Yemen, maybe not directly attack Iran, but to hatch some sort of plot there, and to directly attack Yemen. That may occur. But ultimately, when the will is there for a people to resist and to clear their land of a foreign occupier, it will continue no matter what. No matter who is backing it and what iteration it comes through, we're going to see that resistance remains. So I don't believe that resistance is dead and that the Palestinian cause is dead. And I think we just have to wait. And we also have to look back, turn back to the pages of history to get a more sober view of what's going to happen next.
I guess that's the operative word, striving for a more sober view of this incredibly, understandably emotional issue as well. So thanks so much. We could probably keep talking about this for another 4 hours, but unfortunately, we do have to end. So thanks so much, Robert Inlakesh, for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And
Appreciate it.
thanks so much for watching, y'all, here at State of Play at Mint Press News. We will see you next week.